America's electoral system is a fascinating complexity of nuances. Just as it is intriguing, its mechanics are confusing if you're an outsider looking in. And while mired in confusion, within it exist two elements that would serve Australia well, especially when Australia's current leadership is indulgent in self-interest and control and saddled with incompetence. The US electoral system's impeachment and recall powers would make Andrews, Morrison and the rest of Australia's premiers more accountable because, as it stands, Australians are stuck with leaders that are failing to act in our best interest. Accountability no longer exists in Australian politics because Morrison, Andrews, McGowan and Berejiklian have hanging over them serious questions about their competence and even their integrity. Australia's changing political landscape still brings with it devout tribalism. It's this tribalism that is destroying Australia, and tribalism that is unhealthy for the country to progress as a nation. People seem to be wedded to political parties who refuse to acknowledge when their parties have behaved badly, or politicians incapable of admitting when they are wrong, and a lack of accountability is emboldened by a missing opposition that offers no real alternative. Australian politics needs a major overhaul, because when you have governments of the day suspending Parliament to avoid opposition scrutiny, that's an abuse of democracy. A PM who has been intimately involved in sports and car park rorts, failing to order vaccines, or refusing to even read Porter's rape allegation dossier. He's even dragging his feet with investigating his funding for legal costs. But the rot doesn't stop with the PM. Anthony Albanese is a poor opposition leader, and his failure to capitalise on Morrison's failing still sees him lagging in the polls despite those transgressions. Both New South Wales and Victorian parliaments are refusing to sit in a time of crisis. The New South Wales Premier's relationship with the corrupt Darryl Maguire, an ICAC investigation, her shredding of key documents, pork barrelling, and she's still supported by a PM who has all of his own problems. And now the New South Wales Premier is ceasing to hold daily presses. Why? Because she wants to avoid questions or be held accountable by the media at a time that she herself said is the worst for New South Wales. Trust in leadership and transparency in communication is what Australians expect and deserve from their politicians, and yet there's none. Vaccine hesitancy among Australians isn't a fault to be assigned to the community, but a failing of Australia's premiers and Prime Minister. If communication is transparent, it will be trusted, even when that message is unpleasant. But it isn't, and it hasn't been. Now, along with transparency, research shows three factors are critical. We need to create a collective project, we definitely need to avoid polarisation, and the government needs to buffer the burden of restrictions. All governments have chosen not to prioritise COVID control over electoral gains. All have weaponised COVID and played pandemic politics to suit their own political agendas. Mandating vaccines, coercion through shaming, and pitting Australian against Australian to create an insidious form of class division is not what Australia is about. But that is now what the country has become, a divided society driven by politicians without moral conscience or integrity. Government is robbing Australians of their rights and freedoms, and trust in government has been eroded so much that it just no longer exists. And it's apparent Australia's leadership neither trusts or respects Australians, and yet they demand it. Living with COVID doesn't mean hiding from accountability, and yet it does for Australia's leaders. So how does the opposition and Victorian media continue to fail to question the Andrews government when the state is about to enter its most dangerous period? Accessibility, accountability and transparency are essential to democracy, and no more so than in a time of crisis. Secrecy, politicisation and tribalism have greatly impeded Australian government's management of COVID and the drastic consequences for lives and jobs. Poor and wrong advice has become policy without any debate, scrutiny or accountability. Now, it's nature that creates viruses, and it's poor politics that has led to pandemics. Andrews and Sutton have destroyed Victoria, and they have done it with reckless impunity and abandon. Safeguarding Victorians' lives has not been their primary consideration, regardless of what their tribalistic supporters say. And for Andrews, it seems to be about an agenda of control and power. And that power and control has manifested through an opposition that has been missing. A weak opposition has allowed Andrews to grow obscenely strong, and a return to the past in Matthew Guy through a deposed Michael O'Brien, hardly seems that it will be able to hold Andrews to account. Democracy in Australia is no longer a standard of acceptability. It's a cesspit of incompetence and self-interest cloaked in the guise of respectability. It's the sword of Damocles hanging over all Australians, and the catch cry that is so often heard, well, they're all as bad as each other, hardly seems to be the standard we should accept. Australians deserve better.